Hello again, A-level students, and welcome to this quick video lesson looking at the representation of speech in The Handmaid's Tale. And as you know, it's part of a wider series of lessons looking at the construction of Offred's narrative in the novel. There are lots of different ways of presenting speech in a text, or representing speech, we should say. There are different ways that an author can choose, and these different methods, they have subtle effects. They have the effect of making speech seem more direct or more distant to the reader, depending on the method used, and as we will see, they have the effect of increasing or decreasing the narrative voice that stands between the reader and the person speaking. So there is direct speech, which is presented using the speaker's perspective, i.e. whoever actually gave the speech, and is what we would call unmediated. It's presented as if the very words used are presented. So I guess we could think of mediated as being, media means to go through. Unmediated simply means direct, or I guess unmeddled with, you might think. We then have this challenging concept of free indirect speech, which will certainly may not be used very widely in The Handmaid's Tale, but certainly useful to you to think of in other texts. And this is speech used that presented with the narrator's perspective, but the character's voice. So we get this kind of this combination in free indirect speech, this blurring of a narrator's perspective and the character voice. And this is what we might call partly mediated. It's difficult to know in free indirect speech, where it's kind of ambiguous to what extent the language has been meddled with, or has been changed. Indirect speech is where a narrator presents the speaker's words in their own words. So not only is the perspective of speech shifted to the narrator's perspective, but it's also presented not necessarily using the speaker's words. So a final couple there that are also useful to us are representations of speech acts, or representations of speech, which is where a narrator either tells us that a particular speech act has happened, such as he promised her, or he demanded, or she complained, or a representation of speech where a narrator tells us that speech has happened but gives us no details about what's in the speech. So here are some examples based on the little picture that's included in there. You can see, let's imagine in the picture, I witnessed this event between, or your narrator, witnessed this event of speech between the woman and the man, and is later then going to narrate what the woman said to the man. Well, in direct speech, that it might be put in the narration as, everything I say sounds all wrong, she said. And that's unmediated, it's direct. The words have not been changed, the words are presented exactly as they were in speech, and there's other features that we'll look at shortly that help to present direct speech in this example. In free indirect speech, the perspective is shifted, but the words are unmediated. So the original language is kept, with the exception of the switch in perspective. Everything she said sounded all wrong. So that could be a representation of speech where what we are hearing is the direct words that the person spoke, but it's kind of filtered through the narrator's perspective. In indirect speech, then we can see where a narrator will actually mediate the language, will actually change the language. She said that she'd lost faith in her own speech. Well, actually, that is the meaning of what was said, but it isn't the actual direct speech that was used. So here it's presented in the narrator's words. And then the other final two, the representation of speech act and representation of speech, describing the speech act, she was complaining to him. That tells you about the nature of the speech act, and you may remember from pragmatics we looked at the range of possible speech acts. But also then there's a representation of speech where we just know that speech happened and we have no idea about the actual content of speech. The woman and her man spoke. So these form, in the order that they're presented there, a kind of a continuum distancing the reader from the actual act of speech. What we have here is we have a narrator in between the person speaking and the reader, and as we go down this list towards the bottom of the screen, the distance between the reader and the actual speech is growing, and it's becoming less direct, less clear. But another thing that's important to note, particularly in indirect speech or in representation of speech acts, is that the role of the narrator, i.e. the narrator's own perceptions, the narrator's own ideas, the narrator's own words, these are growing. So as we move down the list, the role of the narrator is being foregrounded, and you might say that the nature of the speech is becoming more subjective, less reliable. So an author makes decisions as to how they would present speech, as to whether they want to give the reader an exact impression of what was being said, and the impression that this is direct and authentic, or whether they perhaps want to foreground the intrusion of the narrator in a way that perhaps lessens the reliability of what a reader is hearing. If you're studying Gatsby, you'll know that there's an awful lot of unreliability or ambiguity in the way that speech is represented there, and it would certainly be very worthwhile to apply this model to Gatsby. Okay, let's look in a little more detail at those top three main examples: the direct speech, the free and direct speech, and the indirect speech. The three examples that were given, how do they actually vary? Well, as you can see in direct speech, the speaker's perspective and tense is used. So the first person I is what the speaker would say. They would speak in the first person, but also it's in the present tense. This speaker was speaking in the present tense. Everything I say sounds all wrong. The direct language is used, and it's given a reporting clause, which is the she said. It identifies the person speaking. So direct speech has the reporting clause here. Also, there is speech punctuation, and that may be used, and obviously it's conventional and standard to use speech punctuation, but a lot of particularly more modern authors do not use speech punctuation. They can use italics. They're sometimes speech is sometimes introduced using dashes. It isn't the defining feature of direct speech that speech punctuation is used. Just because it isn't punctuated in speech marks doesn't mean that it's direct speech. Okay, so we think about different ways in which direct speech can be presented in regards to its punctuation. The defining feature of the direct speech is that the speaker's words and the speaker's perspective are used. With free and direct speech, we see that the speaker's words are used, but the perspective has shifted to that of the narrator. So the pronoun I has become she, and the tense has shifted from the present tense to the past tense because the narrator is reporting this speech from a later point in time. Everything she said sounded all wrong. But there's no reporting clause in this example, and the exact words are preserved or partly preserved, with the exception of the shifts in tense and the shift in perspective. So this is what we would call an example of free indirect speech, and this has a very powerful effect of presenting a character's speech, but within the flow of narration. And for readers, you get this very subtle effect of it preserving the register of the character's register and the exactness or the feeling of characterization within the speech, but it also blurs into the narrator's perspective. It's a very subtle effect and sometimes quite a difficult one to identify. Perhaps easier to identify is the final example, the indirect speech. Here, of course, we have again the narrator's perspective and tense. but we have that reporting clause that identifies the speaker, and we have the mediated language. So the language has been changed, and we know now that we are experiencing the narrator's words rather than the speaker's words. It's a difficult question to ask whether speech is mediated or unmediated, and you don't always know in certain situations, which is why it can be so hard to identify free indirect speech. So often with free indirect speech, there will be clues in context or clues in register. Sometimes you get the feel of the character's voice, even though it's actually presented through the narrator's perspective. So here, the man's response, we've got 5 possible responses. Having looked now a little more closely at the detail of how these are formed, can you identify the 5 forms of speech representation in these 5 representations of the man's speech? Pause the video here, have a go, and I'll reveal the answers in just a second. Okay, that illuminated a couple of points. One was the idea that direct speech does not necessarily have a conventional speech punctuation. And in this example of direct speech, at the top, me too, he said, we need a writer. That was direct speech, but it was presented using an unconventional method, italicization. But even if that speech hadn't been italicized, it still would have been direct, because it preserves the perspective and the words of the speaker. Okay. So here are some further and more detailed examples for you to explore this information through The Handmaid's Tale. And we have here 6 examples which represent speech, in a variety of different ways, all of which can be meaningfully interpreted in different contexts. So we need to remember when we read a novel that speech presentation is highly flexible. It doesn't follow strict rules, and authors can switch between different kinds of speech within a short passage for specific effects. Now, Offred's narrative presents speech in a variety of ways, sometimes imagined, sometimes remembered, sometimes more direct. In these following 6 examples, can you identify the methods used to present speech, but can you also interpret perhaps why or the effect of that in the context of the quote that's presented? Pause the video, have a go, good luck. Okay, so you can review your own attempt at interpreting different speech presentation with my feedback here. In example A, we get an example of the aunts, and there's a lot of Offred represents a lot of remembered speech from the aunts. And this is almost always presented in this way. It's always unpunctuated. There's no example of speech marks used, I don't think, with the aunts, and I'll explain why that is later, because there are some rules that Atwood seems to follow. This is an example of remembered speech. It's direct. It has the reporting clause, said Aunt Lydia, but there's no speech punctuation. And the register implies this unmediated speech. When Offred, and we said before, how do I know if it's mediated or unmediated? How do I know if it's been meddled with? How do I know whose voice I'm hearing? Well, actually, you get a sense of the register. Now, Aunt Lydia has this authoritative register. She has this commanding register, and you get a sense as you read the novel of her voice. It's quite stern, it's quite passionate, and I think we get a sense here of unmediated speech in that this is being presented as Aunt Lydia's own words. In the second example, B, we get an example of Offred imagining speech, which we're set up for. His level smile implies what he's telling us. She's actually exploring here through the appearance of his face and his tone, the way that she's kind of imagining what he's actually saying. But this is mediated speech. This isn't what the anchorman is saying. Everything will be all right soon, I promise. There will be peace. You must trust. You must go to sleep like good children. It's actually got this patronizing fatherly register. What the speech presentation is doing here is perhaps conveying the tone of the man's speech, but having actually twisted the words. So this is an example of indirect speech, but it's actually quite distant in that we know here that it's Offred putting the words in this man's mouth, and that this isn't his direct speech. For C, we get an example of the way that Atwood presents speech in the present of Offred's narrative, and that's fully punctuated with reporting clauses in a very standard way. And this is true of all of Offred's present tense presentation of speech. So everything within the commander's household moving forwards in the narrative is presented in this much more conventional way. The example in D has a combination of some direct but unpunctuated speech and some indirect speech. The final sentence there is a kind of an indirect remembered speech of Luke's response, where he says that night he couldn't go to sleep at all. He said he was so high. Well, it has to be indirect because the perspective has been changed. With example E, we see a feature that Atwood uses in some dream sequences, but often uses where she's imagining speech or remembering speech from a very distant past. And that's the italicized method of presenting speech. And this is imagined. It's obviously mediated. There isn't a particular person speaking here. It's kind of a generalized way of Offred talking about the way people used to speak in general. Final example there, again, is an example of Offred reporting imagined speech. And here you can see it in the register. She uses here the register of the commander's wives, and it's clearly mediated. It's clearly, it's obviously, we know from the context of the text that Offred is making up this speech, but she's giving it all the characteristics of the way that the commander's wives, she imagines the way that they would speak in private. It's interesting to look at this section and understand that Offred doesn't here use reporting clause. The narrative doesn't use reporting clauses. Instead, and if you read the longer extract in chapter 19, instead there are colons used to separate narrative from this kind of imagined speech. You can see that as an example in the final sentence. So overall then, how do we interpret speech generally in the Handmaid? Well, mostly Offred's narration mostly presents speech directly, but there are a variety of methods used flexibly. There are blurred distinctions between imagined, remembered and more direct forms of speech, and these often have distinctive methods used to present them. So I guess the more distant the speech is to Offred's narration, the more distancing devices in speech representation are used. And as a rule, and a good example of that is the fact that when Offred is narrating what are present tense events in the chronology of the narrative, and that is all the events that happen in the commander's household, that kind of speech is presented as direct speech and is given conventional punctuation and also frequent reporting clauses. So this includes her opening interaction with Serena Joy, as presented here in the image from the graphic novel. Also, a lot of her interactions with the commander and with Nick, all of which take place in Offred's kind of present and are framed in the present tense. They are all conventionally punctuated.
But as Offred's narrative slips into the past, not only the near past of Gilead, for example, her recollection of the aunts, but also the deeper past of her life pre-Gilead, we then don't get punctuated speech. However, speech is often still presented directly. But the lack of punctuation, and I think as well probably less reporting clauses, mean that the reader gets a slightly downplayed sense of the reliability of what's being said here. We start to understand more that this is Offred imagining or reimagining events from memory, and therefore it has a less direct feel. We can't accurately evaluate and apply these rules, however, because different methods of speech representation are used very flexibly within the text. The only way of really getting to grips with it is through practice, is through looking at a particular chapter or looking at a particular section and asking yourself, whose words are these? How far is the perspective and tense been changed? Are there reporting clauses? What method of punctuation has been used to introduce speech? Making a decision about whether it's indirect or direct, and then examining how that functions in the context of the extract. A great idea would be for you to look at a chapter or an extended passage of the novel now and to apply your understanding of different forms of speech representation to that passage, and write an evaluation of the way that the narration is representing speech in this context. Thank you for your attention. Here's a quick summary of what we've learned. We know that authors use a variety of different methods to represent speech in narratives. We know that these different methods can increase the distance between speech and the reader, and they can have the effect of foregrounding the narrator's own voice over the voice of the person speaking, or the other way around. They can give the emphasis perhaps to the voice of the speaker and downplay the narrator's own voice. We've also looked at how a variety of these different speech representation methods are used flexibly in the Handmaids, especially the way that different forms can be used to present dialogue where it's remembered, imagined, or even where it's more immediate and taking place in the present. I hope you find this lesson useful. Make sure that you pause at the key moments to update your notes. Please complete the tasks, have a look at a chapter now and try and apply this, frankly quite complex and challenging concept of speech representation. Try and apply it independently to a section or a range of sections that you choose. As always, good luck with your studies and see you next time.